I've surprised myself more than once when I've picked up a news headline since Memorial Day and read another piece or a small part of someone talking about what happened to George Floyd. I watch that clip and can't unring that bell in my mind. And I just find myself bursting into tears. Somewhere in that 8 minutes and 45 seconds, somewhere in there, maybe about halfway, I was still screaming, no, no, and feeling suddenly that that is my son, that is my child, pushed to the concrete like that, being slowly murdered by a uncaring man. Not just a man. That doesn't really describe that police officer. It's more in the uniform and the guns and the mace that he threatened to turn back the few bystanders who dared to challenge him. It wasn't just this person. It was the entire, institution, an ancient institution of feeling entitled to be brutal, having been trained to be entitled to take away a man's freedom or a woman's freedom, trained to be able to arrest and handcuff and restrict and throw in the back of a car and throw into a cell. That's a whole system of man's inhumanity to man. And as I watched it in action that day, and I watched the man kneeling on George's neck and 3 other officers in sight who essentially did nothing. And in fact, that's not really true. It isn't that they did nothing. They weren't innocent bystanders. They were protecting him and ready to hold back the crowds who would otherwise demand something, something human. And I was so enraged. And I thought, I don't know this man. And I thought things like, this is just one incident that we just happened to catch in the broad daylight, and someone happened to video on their phone. And I thought of all the ones that are happening and have happened in the dark. So much savagery and war and murders. And yet, as I watched and think about George Floyd and think that his life is gone under the excuse of being punished for a pack of cigarettes, the excuse of taking his life because perhaps he gave a counterfeit $20 bill. When I think a man ruthlessly murdered before our eyes over $20, I think about what officer is going to knock on George's mother's door and say, "We've killed your son because he perhaps stole a pack of cigarettes." And my mind races to all the millions of people who have been murdered in our so-called civilization. And for what better reason? That we send our young people to a war that has less of a reason than a $20 bill. Yes, I have. I got enraged and depressed on this because I forgot to have faith. And looking at such a horrible example of what we are capable of, for just a while, I forgot to have faith. I forgot to know and remember that there is a force going on that is actually looking out for all of us. And yes, it's angels, is no question. I won't mince words about that. I see my angel, I hear my angel, so it is very, very real. And then I went to look at what is a $20 bill. You know, I started that Google hole that I actually am way too often falling into. But in this case, often I find spirits and my angel can communicate well in that digital world and just sort of pop up something on my screen that they want me to see. And so up comes this picture of the $20 bill, and it is one that is with Harriet Tubman's face on the front, and that it has been in the works for a number of years, since 2016, and was to be released now, upcoming, for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, in which women were given the right to vote. And Trump has stopped that process, not just out of his racial bias and his denigration of all women. It's really Spirit showing me what's really going on here. When you look at the history of that 19th Amendment, for example, you see that, so that on June 4th, 1919, the Senate passed the 19th Amendment bill, but it took 4 more times and 5 amendments, something like that, each vote extremely close. And so many men, who were the voters, of course, continuing to oppose giving women the right to vote. How unconscionable that we would now, in 2020, be engaged in the same kind of blatant fear and hatred and prejudice. And so on the one hand, we think nothing has changed. But on the other hand, I see that the synchronicity around this $20 bill is to show us that this is a very big breakthrough, that we are right on the verge of it. You can feel the uprising. Yes, we have an uprising in Minneapolis, but we have an uprising of our consciousness. We have an uprising from our sleep, from our discouragement and thinking. And my goodness, I have been there so often and many times, but especially in the past week, thinking after all this time, 500 years of slavery. You know, I've talked about the 500-year cycle, and we are now in the renewal, or the new cycle, where all of that is to shift. And the truth is, in history, the first slaves were brought to the Americas in 1526. These little synchronicities help put me back in my faith, because then I can step back some from the demonstrations, the politics, the cruelty in the world, the inhumanity. And I can then get my Google hole into something that did happen next, which was I saw there's a guy, Richard Youngs, and he has studied protest movements at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And so he was quoted last week as saying, they are becoming, meaning these demonstrations for peace, they're becoming a mainstream phenomenon that I think is here to stay as a core feature of global politics. Now that's quite a statement, acknowledging that the old patriarchal structures, all of them, what we're seeing is the crumbling, the avalanching, the tidal flooding, however you want to think of it. It's the inevitable conclusion of a long learning, many lessons learned and tested over 500 years since we brought to America slavery, since we brought to America in the lands we now call Mexico. We brought there, Cortez brought the smallpox, and violence and disease wiped out millions upon millions, 80% of the entire Aztec nation. It's no accident that 500 years ago it was the Protestant Revolution. Protestant, protest, right? And 500 years ago, the protests were saying, I don't need a king or a pope to go be an intermediary between me and my direct communications with God. At the same time, 500 years ago in science, Kepler came along, and we had the startling discovery, and that's what we're going to be feeling now, like we're making some sort of startling discovery, but actually the discovery was about what had been true all along, and that is that the universe didn't revolve around the Earth, and in fact, the Earth and all those other round rocks out there were orbiting the sun. And my blog on Trump from 2018, I called him the king of the mountain and talked about that dictatorship that we have all had the uprising against since 2008. And all of us just need to do, I think I said it also in my last forecast, that what the stars also do for me, just the concrete twinkling in the heavens above me, they pull me to look up. And yes, that's a physical action, but it's also the spiritual call to do the exact same thing. And to trust and relax, because we actually do know. We actually know what to do. We actually do know what's happening. It's just that sometimes we deny that we have already learned this. We have already been through this kind of agony again and again and again. In fact, in history, it's not too long ago that the famous Stanford prison experiment was conducted by Zimbardo, and it just is an amazing revelation. He went on to study this same phenomenon at Abu Ghraib, and we can say that's exactly the same phenomenon that happened May 25th, Memorial Day of 2020, and that is that when you give power to a group. So in the Stanford prison experiment, just randomly picked graduate students were divided into guards and prisoners. And the guards turned sadistic so quickly that less than 2 days into the experiment, he had to call it all off because it became so cruel and damaging. And so does power corrupt? And does power corrupt? Absolutely. Absolutely. And especially if we think for how many 500-year cycles, and there have been many, that we have a history of people abusing their power, especially people so-called elected to the position, in sort of the same way Zimbardo elected so-called those Stanford graduate students. And so what have we learned, and what is the lesson? It's a beautiful one if you stop and think about it. And that is that we don't just have like rotten apples. We have rotten barrels. We have whole systems that you can put almost anyone into, and they will be rotted by the system's paradigms, rather than being able to hold on to their own individual. Maybe they were very ethical, and maybe they had lots of integrity coming in, but could not find a place or an expression for that. And so let me add now some astrological timetable to what we are seeing and experiencing. So the peak of that big meetup of Saturn and Pluto was in January, mid-January. So many events happened right at that occasion that have catapulted us into this situation we're in now. Especially, that's when we really found out the first death was announced of the virus. So we now have our economy avalanching down. It was already just propped up by toothpicks anyway. And we have all of these systems now that cannot hold because of the domino effect. Now, are we done? No, we're not done. We have a little bit of a respite now as Saturn has gone on into Aquarius, but he's coming back. And this summer, especially August and September, we have all of the outer planets, and then sometimes Mars and also Mercury retrograde. And during that time, we are getting a up close and personal look at who we are, at the world that we live in. And of course, what wants to be remembered here is truly who you are. You are not a body running around bumbling through this life on earth that by and large has been dictated, well, by a lot of dictators, but the biggest one being our own ego. Now we get to think that through, and we're going to see some very stark and startling wake-up calls because we need them. And it is kinder that we are getting it all at once and in a big hurry, because we could end our suffering more quickly when everyone sees that the road we have been on, not only, it's not even just that we've come to a crossroads anymore, that's already happened. It's just the road we've been on is dissolving under our very feet. And we don't yet know that we're going to land on something much, much better, but we are. And so we're going to get another look, sort of a more than a deja vu. We're going to get a revisiting of the same shift phenomenon that was exact in January. And it's coming back because Saturn picks up his old Capricorn path and will run right back up to within a couple degrees of Pluto. And Saturn starts that in July the 2nd, because of course he's retrograde, backing back up into Capricorn. And he's going to stay in Capricorn and will be very close to having another meetup with Pluto just in time for the November election on November 3rd, 2020 in the United States. And I'm talking astrologically, not politically, but astrologically. November 3rd, 2020, that election has an enormous, almost cataclysmic event. And it has a strong echo from the November election in 2000, when there was all of the ballot fraud and cheating and so forth in Florida. And so we have, and we already sense it, that there's going to be cheating. We already see that Trump is willing to do anything to stay in power. And I mean anything, right? He doesn't even care what we think of what he's doing. Nothing. It's all justified for him if he can hold power. So that is going to come to a great big head. And I think by November 14th and 15th, we are going to be watching something on a political scale that tells us the system we've had, the party system I'm talking about, Democrats and Republicans, is, and the whole electoral college thing, right, is just a mess. And we will welcome the crumbling of it once we are through with all this. And of course, people are asking me, clients and also friends, Judith, when do we return to normal? When are we through with this? So get this. There is no return to normal. That's not going to happen. You see, that's what has dissolved. That's what has fallen away. That's what the wrecking ball hit, and it really has crumbled. So we have to stop romancing the past like melancholy babies, right? Because we don't even want to return to what we had. And we definitely will see that we don't want to return to so-called normal. And we'll know that by November, I'm certain. And so what we really want to say, I want to say to you is there's no returning to normal, and this is not going to be over. This is the beginning. What we are in now is the dawning of a new cycle. And this is the cycle in which we will move into the true action of the Aquarian age. Because in December, we do get a big shift in December, and that is when both Saturn and Jupiter go into the humanitarian sign of Aquarius. It still isn't easy. It's not an easy time, but there we are going to all hopefully realize what Martin Luther King has been saying since the 60s, what so many brilliant minds have been saying for eons and right now, which is what happens to one of us happens to all of us. We are in this together, and we cannot deny it anymore. We can't be in denial about that anymore, because it's going to just be in our faces. Just like the murder of George Floyd on May the 25th of 2020. So we may still want to think that the way of the world, the way we have structured our lives, our civilization, our politics, our police, everything, our own lives, that we have structures that we're going to be so much happier to be without them. We're going to be so much happier that they have in fact fallen away. And we won't want to be in denial about what we know. So I say to you what I say to my clients, right? Know what you know. Remember who you truly are. Truly, we are these big, compassionate hearts. We have such empathy for one another's suffering. We have such a connection one with the other, and that, of course, what many people are saying, including myself, that the beautiful, contagious spirit of that loving compassion and kindness is what is going to save us. And we want that to be contagious. So these are the thoughts we can think and the intentions we can set in our own personal life. Such, for example, I'm willing to see this differently. I'm willing to look at what is true. I am willing to take off my green glasses, pull back the curtain, and see Oz for what he really is, another mortal man bumbling around like all of us. Coming now, June 5th and June 20th are two eclipses, and Friday, June 5th is the full moon eclipse in the fiery sign of zealous truth-teller Sagittarius. So that is going to be quite heated. Don't expect that things will calm down. Things are building to a crescendo. So just carefully watch how it's showing up in yourself and in your own life. And then on June 20th, we have a phenomenon. We have the solstice, the summer solstice, which is the day that the sun goes into the sign of Cancer. But on this solstice, we also have the moon at the exact same day going into the sign of Cancer. So we have the sun and moon meeting up at 0 degrees Cancer for another eclipse, this one being a new moon eclipse. And this is where we set the stage for a new paradigm, not just a new lunar month, but a new season in which we pray and acknowledge our need for serenity, for our own sanctuaries, for our own homes to be at peace, where we practice kindness, unconditional kindness, and we practice being as helpful as we possibly can to the person who is next to us, who is standing in front of us. And you plant that intention on June 20th and set aside that day, that time, to be quiet, to pray, to meditate, to reach out to those that you love. And know that is an action step. That is you doing something by being who you truly are. So thanks for walking through this with me, and know that I am with you too in these very challenging times, and that we are walking hand in hand. We are walking each other home. Thanks for listening so much. Thank you so much. And you can always reach me at email judith@judithroyal.com. Bye for now.